The video game crash of 1983. A pretty important event in video gaming history because without it we wouldn't have such things as quality control in the video game industry. Nintendo would have never rose to prominence, and Atari would have never fallen in the way they did. But is this really true? This is a question I'm asking myself today. What if there was no video game crash in 1983? How would the industry play out? Would we even have a PlayStation or an Xbox in 2016? So, I'm going to go from 1983 to 2016 in a set of alternate events where the video game crash never happened to see what the future would be like. But first, I have to change something in the past so that the video game crash can never occur. And in order to understand this, we need to understand what happened in the past to make the video game crash happen. So first of all, we're going to go to 1979 and look at the video game market then. These are the three consoles that were out at the time. The Atari 2600 on the far left, the Intellivision in the center, and on the far right, the Magnavox Odyssey 2. These were probably the three best consoles out at the time. And with just three consoles out, you might think it was okay, just like we have today with the Wii U, the PS4, and the Xbox One. But that wasn't the case. There were way more consoles than just three. As you can see here, there's tens of consoles out at the time. I haven't even listed all of them. These are just some of the consoles that were more prominent at the time. And this brings me on to my next problem. Not a lot of them had very good games. But where did this problem spring up? Well, we're going to take a trip to Atari in the same year to find out what's going on there, where four video game developers, Alan Miller, David Crane, Bob Whitehead, and Larry Kaplan, go to the CEO of Atari, Raymond Cassar, demanding higher wages and more respect for the games they make. This was at a time before video game developers were respected, and as such they were only paid about $10,000 a year, but their games made way more than that, so they demanded more money. Raymond Cassar dismissed these claims as absolutely insulting to Atari, and said that they were towel boys and anyone could do their job just as well. So, the four wanted to spit back in Atari's face. How were they going to do this? Well, they formed their own company called Activision. And what made Activision so different from other video game companies at the time was that Activision didn't make its own console, and it didn't make its own arcade cabinets. Instead, it decided that it was going to develop its own games for other consoles that were already out at the time. This is something that would be known as third-party developing, but it was a pretty new concept at the time, as Activision were only the first third-party developers in the world. But Atari were pretty outraged at this, and later filed a lawsuit against Activision, claiming that they infringed upon copyright policies. However, the court ruled in favor of Activision, claiming that Activision had infringed upon no copyright policies, and that they were free to do as they wished. Because Atari was so easy to program for, they could program for the system without infringing upon any copyright policies. Another thing that pissed Atari off was that Activision were making a lot of profit for this. I mean, people were buying Atari 2600s, but what many people failed to understand is that when you buy a system from a company that makes a console, they don't actually make a profit. They make the profit based on the games they're putting out for the system. And when they're not putting out the games that are getting sold for the system, they're not making money. Activision are, because they're putting out the games like Pitfall, Stampede, and River Raid that people are buying. People are still going to buy Pac-Man and Pole Position and Space Invaders, but not nearly as much as they're going to buy these games because they're new. And while this was good for other people too, such as Parker Brothers and Imagic, who made great games for the 2600, there were some other less experienced developers who simply tried to put out their own unfinished messes onto the Atari 2600 without understanding what they were doing, thinking that simply because it was a video game, it was just going to sell well. What this led to were some of the most downright bizarre and worst games of all time, including educational games, glitch fests, and yes, even pornography games. I'm not kidding. Look it up. And then there's this, the E.T. game for Atari 2600, which is widely considered to be one of the worst games of all time, made by Atari themselves. This was probably the biggest event in the lead up to the crash, but there were other events leading up to it too, including competition from PCs. Nowadays it's silly to think that the PC is a threat to the consoles or vice versa because many people see them as their own separate things. But back then, the PCs were big enough and the consoles small enough to be considered a threat, because the Commodore 64 and Apple II, the home computers at the time, could play the same games as the 2600 with better graphic and sound capabilities, and could also do things that a console simply couldn't do despite costing more. So Atari is under fire from all sides thanks to lack of third-party control, poor quality games, no reviewing systems, too many consoles at the time, and a threat from PCs. So, my solution to this problem: get rid of Raymond Cassar. Here we are now. If we get rid of Raymond Cassar, the developers will be paid fairly for their work and thus they'll never leave Atari, and people won't rush to just develop whatever game they can for the system, because they'll think professionals have to do it, like we do now. So who do we replace Raymond Cassar with? A man called Nolan Bushnell. You might ask yourself who he is, but I'll explain. Nolan Bushnell was one of the co-founders in Atari in 1972 and helped develop the Pong arcade cabinet along with Ted Dabney. So how did he get replaced? It started in 1976 when Atari were currently using the money from their Pong console to simply develop a home computer system that aimed to bring the arcades home via cartridges. Why I'm highlighting 1976 was because this was the year in which some events happened for Atari that they would rather not have happened. Another company came out with their own home console in the same year. The Fairchild were released in 1976. This was a pretty big problem for Atari because they weren't expecting any other competitors to come out until at least 1978, when the Atari 2600 was expected to launch. So now Atari needed a lot of money so they can get their console out on the market first before the Fairchild Channel F takes its place as the most popular console on the market. So they need money from someone. So they go to a company called Warner Communications, who buy out Atari for $30 million. And as such, Atari now have enough money to research the 2600, develop it, and put it out in the market within a year of the sellout. Then the Atari 2600 becomes the most popular console of the second generation, and everything is happy until the video game crash. So we simply remove Warner Communications from the equation. Atari go ahead and release the 7800 in 1978. And now, what happens to Fairchild? Do they become popular in the place of Atari? My guess is no, because despite what Atari thought at the time, the Fairchild Channel F was never built to compete with anything. It was simply a demo system, like the Odyssey. The only games on it were sports games and tech demos, and trying to show off the impressive graphical capabilities. So, the Channel F doesn't become popular. Is Atari out on its own in the video game industry? No. There's one other competitor. The Magnavox Odyssey 2? How do we arrive at this? The Magnavox Odyssey 2 would probably never have been developed if not for the Atari 2600's popularity. So, why is this out? Well, my guess is that the Magnavox Odyssey 2 would be developed to fill the void that the Atari 2600 left in the year that it was gone in the altered events. So therefore, Magnavox will be able to release the Magnavox Odyssey 2 and become popular in the place of Atari. They have a parent company called Philips, who are able to fund them and get them research and get them the parts they need and finally put the console out on the market before Atari can even put theirs out. So, what knock-on effects do these have? Well, there's one very big one: the games. So you have Yar's Revenge, River Raid, Stampede, and Pitfall, all first-party games for Atari that are selling the 2600, but on the Odyssey 2 side, you have a lot of Atari 2600 games. Why is this? It's because Atari never developed any of these games. Pac-Man was developed by Namco, Pole Position also was developed by Namco, and Space Invaders was developed by Taito, and Berserk is yet another arcade game that Atari did not make. Atari simply bought out the rights to these, so no one else could use them, which made it more difficult for companies who were looking to compete with Atari to do exactly that. But now that the Odyssey has filled the void that Atari left, they're the ones who are shutting out the competition, including Atari. But wait, is there another console in competition other than Atari? Yes, there is. There's one other console. Let's take a look at this small little playing card company from Japan called Nintendo. Nintendo released an arcade cabinet called Donkey Kong. See, on the left, you have the one they released with the 2600. This is obviously a very big disappointment for Nintendo because it looks nothing like the arcades, and it doesn't even play like it. It plays terribly. So, they wanted a console where they could release it to make it look exactly like the arcades. That console shows the game on the right. What console is this? It was a console released in 1972, or 1982, called the ColecoVision. So now we have three consoles: the Nintendo ColecoVision, the Philips Magnavox Odyssey 2, and the Atari 2600. I figured that Nintendo and Coleco could enter into an agreement like they did in the real events, but because there's no video game crash to upset the deal, then Nintendo will become a first-party developer for Coleco. So now we can look at the future. Video game industry at a time when Nintendo would have become the top dog. Who will make the advance forward into the next generation? Who's going to push forward video game technology to new levels? Is there room for a fourth competitor? Join me next time to find out if any of these questions have answers. I've been the man with a plan.